Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 17th of August 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion. PMO denies RTI plea seeking info on PM cares appears on page number 9. Now this news talks about how various kinds of information were denied to an RTI activist by the Prime Minister office. And this particular news appears with respect to an RTI file with regard to PM cares fund and its utilization. And the grounds which were chosen to deny the information was that in order to provide the information sought by the activist, the Prime Minister office would have to disproportionately divert the resources of the office. Now there is a section in the RTI Act, section 7(9), which says that an information shall ordinarily be provided in the form in which it is sought unless it would disproportionately divert the resources of the public authority or would be detrimental to safety or preservation of the record in question. So basically in general circumstances, almost all the information has to be provided by the PIOs. But on various occasions, information which is sought by the people is so massive and so huge that it could not be humanly possible to publish those reports and provide that information. And hence this particular section has been included. Because in this particular instance, RTI activist Commodore Lokesh Batra had filed an RTI request asking for the total number of RTI applications and appeals received and disposed of in the Prime Minister office since April 2020. And he wanted a particular information as to how many of those RTI appeals were related to PM Cares and Prime Minister's National Relief Fund. A response was given by Prime Minister Office to Commodore Lokesh Batra saying that the information sought by you is not maintained in this office in compiled form. Its collection and compilation would disproportionately divert the resources of this office from the efficient discharge of its normal functions, thereby attracting provisions under section 7(9). So in this regard, it becomes important for us to understand the various kinds of issues being faced by Right to Information Act, especially 14 to 15 years after its implementation. There is no way the importance of RTI Act and various issues can be overemphasized as far as our UPSC syllabus is concerned. It can be asked in your GS paper 2, GS paper 4, as well as right to information is an important topic from the perspective of essay as well. In the past also UPSC has asked questions specifically related to RTI Act. Now there are two aspects of understanding RTI Act. First aspect is that we understand the normal functioning, provisions, various mechanisms of RTI Act. That is more important from the perspective of prelims examination. And the second aspect of RTI Act is that we understand various kinds of issues and roadblocks or bottlenecks in the way RTI Act functions, which will be from the perspective of mains examination. So since this particular news which has appeared in the newspaper today deals with one of the bases on which the information is denied to citizens, we will first discuss other kind of issues and we'll segregate them into demand side and supply side issues, as well as we'll look at the issues faced at Information Commission and State Information Commission levels. Once we have done that, then in the last of this video, in the Prelims Pointer section, we will go through the basics of RTI Act. So as we all know, RTI Act became operational on 12th of October 2005. This law empowered Indian citizens to seek information from public authorities and hence making the government and its functionaries more accountable as well as responsible. But the functioning of RTI Act in last 14 to 15 years has not been quite up to the mark or not been the way it was expected or designed to act. And hence, obviously, it leads us to question that why it has not been able to function the way it was expected to. And there are many reasons for that. And one of the major reasons behind the issues being faced by RTI Act is the very short implementation time of this act, which did not provide time
for either the people in the government as well as common people and their mindset to change. It was not sufficient to create infrastructure, develop new processes, and build new capacities in order to implement various kinds of provisions and mechanisms envisioned in the RTI Act. And hence, a lot of issues have emerged. So, one set of issues can be categorized into demand side of the information. This pertains to the information seeker side, and it deals with the issues and constraints faced by the information seeker while filing for information request. Then comes the supply side. Now this dimension pertains to the public information officers, nodal department for RTI implementation, and various kinds of other interdepartmental challenges which deal with the supply of the information. And finally come the adjudicatory side, or the issues being faced by the information commissioners or commissions. So we'll discuss them one by one. So let us now start with demand side issues. And one of the major problems in the implementation of RTI Act is the low public awareness. Now at this point of time you should know that section 26 of the Act states that the appropriate government may develop and organize educational program to advance the understanding of the public, especially the disadvantaged communities, regarding how to exercise the rights contemplated under the Act. But a survey conducted by Department of Personnel and Training has found out that nodal departments and state governments have not undertaken any substantial steps to promote the RTI Act. The ultimate result is that awareness level is very low among the disadvantaged communities, especially the women and people belonging to SC/ST sections. Then the next major hurdle in the demand side of the problem is the quality of awareness. And this deals with the awareness regarding types of organization covered under the RTI Act. And it is important to highlight that the quality of RTI awareness among common people is very low. For example, the results of a survey conducted by Central Information Commission is displayed on your screen. The table on the screen illustrates the percentage of the people who responded in affirmative to the questions analyzing the table. You can easily see how low the quality of awareness is among the general public. For example, only quarter of the people surveyed in Andhra Pradesh had the awareness that they have the right to ask for all information provided about any organization. And hence it can be said that while the Act has been clear in defining the responsibility of the appropriate governments, especially with respect to creating awareness of the Act, there has been a lack of initiative from the government side. These efforts have not been helpful in generating mass awareness of the RTI Act. So the first two issues related to demand side deal with the lack of awareness and education on the part of the public. This is a fault of not only the public itself, but it is also a failure of the responsibility given to the government to carry out the mass level awareness programs. Then moving on to the issues related to constraint faced in filing application. And again, various sections of the RTI Act themselves mandate many of the things which are not being conducted. For example, under the section 6 of the RTI Act, PIOs are required to provide reasonable assistance to the applicant in drafting and submission of the applications. But more often than not, it was found out that this assistance is denied when a person walks into an office of PIO, citing busy schedule as one of the most frequently used alibi. Then the section 26 of the RTI Act makes it a duty of appropriate government to publish and distribute user manuals or guidelines, which will be read by the applicant in order to fulfill the procedures. Similarly, section 27 and 28 specify the responsibility of the appropriate governments to make rules pertaining to the implementation of RTI Act. Let us see how various states have fared. Just take the example of publication of user guides. Considering only these 5 states, you can see that none of them at the state level have published the user manual. Also, the standard format for filing of applications has not been given out by Andhra Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh as well as Assam. So these are the hurdles being faced by the applicants as far as the demand of the information is concerned. Another issue observed in the survey was that the payment mechanisms prescribed in some of the state rules are very inconvenient to the citizens, especially those applying from the locations outside the concerned states. For example, the application fee in Odisha can only be paid through treasury challans and banker's check. So these are the kinds of small bottlenecks which the applicants face. Then comes the issue of poor quality of information which is provided. Because more often than not, the way in which the information is communicated to the RTI applicant leaves them extremely dissatisfied. Now you need to understand that the quality of information or the response provided is a direct consequence or even the function of record management practices within the public authority. The way in which record is maintained, ultimately it is going to decide how the information is disseminated. Then also the kind of processes and the transparency which has been adopted in those processes in between or in within the offices will also determine the quality of the information or the data. Because if there is a lot of opaqueness in which a particular office functions, then obviously the data cannot be revealed with full transparency. Then also the training of the public information officer is very crucial. If the person is not trained properly, which is often the case with Indian offices right now, there is a very little diligence while giving the information out to the public. And finally, there is also a problem in the way RTI applications are drafted by the common citizens. And obviously, because they do not get the kind of support they are assured by the RTI Act, drafting does becomes an issue. And finally comes the issue of constraints faced in inspection of records. Now, Section 2J of the RTI Act provides for the inspection of the official records, which says that right to information means the right to information accessible under this Act, which is held or under the control of any public authority, and it also includes the right to inspection of work, documents, records, taking notes, extracts or certified copies of documents or records, taking certified samples of material, and obtaining information in the form of floppies, tapes, video cassettes, and various other forms. So these are also a right under Right to Information Act. But to your utter surprise, there are hardly any offices currently in our country which allows open inspection of their records. And the major reason behind that is inadequate awareness of this particular provision of the RTI Act. So far we have discussed the issues on the demand side of the RTI. Let us now focus our attention to the supply side of the RTI Act. And let us now begin the discussion on the supply side issues, or the issues being faced on the side where the information is being supplied. RTI Act maintains the issuance of information within 30 days, but currently there exists no measure and process for an information commission to view the adherence level of this provision of the Act. Then the next major set of challenges come from the training as well as motivation of the public information and first appellate authorities. We know that the level of training of these two institutions is very low. For example, a study conducted by Central Information Commission found out that only 55% of those surveyed had received any kind of training in dealing with the RTI Acts and its provisions. And one of the major reasons cited behind that was the frequent transfers of public information officers. You know that these officers are the personnel of the same department who are then deputed as PIOs. And before they can learn all the sections and details mechanisms of the RTI Act, they are transferred into some other kind of responsibilities within the department. This also places an additional workload on the training institutes entrusted with providing RTI training. Here it is also pertinent to mention that PIOs lack motivation to implement RTI Act. PIOs have often cited that there is no incentive for them in order to take such a huge responsibility. And PIOs at state level are generally not provided with any kind of support staff. So from photo state and Xerox to disbursement of the information, all are done by a single person, even at the highest level of the bureaucracy. Then comes the way in which the records are maintained in our offices. And you know that obsolete record management guidelines owe their genesis in ineffective record management tools being utilized by the government offices, as well as lack of collection of information from the field offices. And hence it can be said that current record management framework at state at central level is not geared to meet the requirements specified under RTI Act. There is a lack of any electronic document management system in any department, especially on the state level, and majority of PIOs do not even maintain the list of RTI applications electronically. So these are the troubles from the demand side, especially dealing with the record management guidelines. Then comes a very major issue, which is non-availability of basic infrastructure. Because the implementation of the RTI requires the PIOs to provide information to the applicants through photocopies and scans, that is also in soft copy. While these facilities are considered to be easily available at district level, it is a big challenge to get information from block level and panchayat level offices. PIOs highlight that the lack of infrastructure hampers the RTI implementation at the panchayat level. For example, up to 97% of the panchayat and block level offices did not have any kind of photocopier. Then comes the issue of limited usage of information technology. The usage of IT in acceptance or delivery of RTI applications is very minimal. The maximum usage of IT in the field of RTI is development of few softwares to track the status of the RTI applications. Beyond this, no other IT solution has been developed by any state or even the central government. And this has led to a lot of problem in the way RTI applications are being disposed of and especially slowed them down. And last but not the least, ineffective implementation of section 4.1b. Now, as per this particular section, one of the basic responsibilities of the public authorities is to disseminate information on a suo motu basis, or we can also call them automatic disclosure, because section 4.1b specifically mentions the type of information which needs to be provided by the public authorities automatically even before someone goes and seeks the information. The Act also mandates to provide other information directly to the public. Now, the usual problem with the government offices is that first, the automatic disclosures are not made. If they are made, the disclosures are not regular. Most of the disclosures do not contain the date on which they were updated. So it could be 10 years old as well. And there is no mechanism within the public authorities to implement these provisions or to ensure its implementation. And neither the state government nor the information commissions have taken adequate steps to ensure compliance of this basic minimum requirement for filing RTI applications. So these are the issues when it comes to the supply side of the information. And finally, moving on to the issues faced at the information commissions. Under the section 25(1) of the RTI Act, Central Information Commission as well as state information commissions are required to submit an annual report on RTI implementation. There is no need to mention that no state or central government so far has done that on a regular basis. Then these information commissions have a perception of being lenient towards the public information officials, and that is born out of the fact that a very low number of PIOs have been penalized so far. Although the information commissions have the power to instinct the public authority to compensate the complainant for any loss or other detriment suffered, however, the information commissions have rarely used their powers. Then comes the lack of monitoring and review mechanisms. Under various sections of the RTI Act, both Central Information Commission as well as State Information Commission have the power to require the public authorities to take necessary steps to secure the compliance with the provisions of this Act. Also, high level of pendency in RTI applications is not hidden from anyone. And finally, the geographical spread of information commissions is such that it leads to a lot of disparity, because majority of information commissions are situated in state capitals, which results in appellants undergoing an additional cost in order to attend the hearings. So these are the major challenges in the way RTI Act functions in our country. Although you can see that mechanisms and provisions are given in the Act itself, but more often than not, the main challenge is to implement and successfully implement those issues on the ground. Let's now move on to the next discussion. This next article appears on page number 1. Airlines fighting to stay airborne. And in the times of need, cargo revenues are providing much needed cushion. Indian Airlines, just like all airlines across the world, have struggled to stay afloat as COVID-19 fears continue to haunt travelers across the world. As infections started to mount and travel restrictions were imposed in early March, the number of unique passenger trips fell by around 33%. And finally, on March 25th, the government imposed a ban on domestic flights, which has recently been lifted. So in this regard, the losses and other such challenges faced by the aviation sector has come into limelight. Also, aviation sector has been mentioned as a specific term in the GS3 syllabus under infrastructure. And hence it becomes important for us to cover this topic wholesomely. And we'll start by first understanding the history of civil aviation industry. So the first flight or the first civil aviation flight in our country was between Karachi and Delhi in 1912. But if we talk about the real airline industry, that was initiated in 1932 by the pioneer of Indian industry, J.R.D. Tata, who founded the Tata Airlines, which was of course later on merged with the Government of India Company in 1948, and together they came to be known as Air India International Limited. Then later on, the domestic and the foreign travel of Indian Airline was bifurcated into two. The government established Indian Airlines Corporation to cater to domestic air travel and Air India International for international air travel passengers. Also, in 1953, through a legislation of the Parliament, the aviation sector was made a national monopoly or the government monopoly, which meant that after the passage of this act, none of the Indian private operators could operate in India. Then finally, in the wake of LPG reforms, government started to open its sky in 1990 and allowed air taxi operators to operate flights from any airport, which ended the monopoly of these two government-owned companies as far as air transport is concerned. And in 30 years from now, not only the private operators are allowed, foreign operators are also allowed, and recently government has also approved foreign direct investment of up to 100% through automatic route. So now we can understand that we started by having a state monopoly in this sector just after the independence, and then finally we have ended up at a point where any foreign firm can acquire an Indian company completely, and that is also through automatic route, which means that no government approval is needed for such an investment. Now, whenever we read news related to aviation sector, we always talk about the immense potential and the growth which the Indian aviation sector has seen. Although the challenges are also talked about in the same length and breadth, but the fact that almost all the major airline transporters across the world are interested to do business in India shows that India has a great potential as far as aviation sector is concerned. For example, according to the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, India's air passenger traffic has grown by at least 16% annually over the past decade. And so obviously, we need to think over the factors which are responsible for such a great growth in the past 2 decades as well as the future potential. So the factors which can be held responsible for the growth of Indian aviation sector can be segregated into 2 parts: demand side factors and supply side factors. As far as the demand for the tickets and the demand for the flights are concerned, there are 3 main causes. First is that we see an increase in per capita income due to rapid economic growth. We are also at the same time observing increasing tendency of the people to travel at domestic locations and also to visit foreign locations. And finally, as India is increasingly being entrenched into global trade, it is resulting into increased trade and commerce, which then requires higher aviation sector demand. So these are as far as demand side factors. But what is causing the increase in the supply of the aviation sector? And those can be segregated into many factors. And of course, the first point is that entry of low cost air transport is one of the major factors which has attracted the people who would prefer AC third class or even second class travel through train, but due to the heavy competition, they are getting flight tickets at almost the same price. We have seen in recent 10 years, a lot of FDI has flown into our country, then of course the current government has a very positive outlook for this sector. And the government has also come out with very unique scheme like Udan and also Navnirman. We'll discuss them in the next slide. Also, there is a trend towards growing private sector participation through PPP route, especially in the infrastructural development. And as a result of all these, India's aviation industry is expected to witness rupees 1 lakh crore worth of investment in next 5 years. And also India plans to increase the number of airports to 250 by 2030 to cater to the growing demand. So as the demand is increasing, various factors have made sure that supply is also matched to the increased demand. In this regard, there are 3 steps by the government which are worth mentioning and keeping in mind. First is National Civil Aviation Policy of 2016. And this policy is especially noteworthy because this is the first aviation policy since the independence. Almost the complete focus of this particular policy was towards ensuring regional connectivity. Also, it aimed at making the air travel extremely affordable and convenient. And at the launch of this, Mr. Narendra Modi had remarked that his aim is to see the people wearing slippers into the air travel. Then of course government came up with Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik or Udan scheme, which is the government's initiative to make air travel to India's tier 2 and tier 3 cities affordable to the people. Now here the idea is to put smaller cities and remote regions on the aviation map by getting domestic airlines to operate more on regional routes. Now you should at the same time understand that regional routes and the tier 2, tier 3 cities do not attract a lot of traffic. But aircraft sizes are not that small. And hence a lot of seats go vacant. And hence it is not always profitable for a private air operator to operate on such routes. And hence the air connectivity to tier 2 and tier 3 cities had been extremely problematic in India. And to encourage that, government came up with Udan schemes. Now it is expected of you to know the features of Udan scheme. You should let us know in the comment section whether you are aware of how government promotes regional connectivity through Udan scheme. And then government came up with Navnirman scheme, which is all about expanding airport capacity by more than 5 times to handle 1 billion trips a year. This scheme is about investments in the airport upgradation as well as launch of new airports, especially the ones owned by Airport Authority of India. So after having talked about the growth potential and the factors as well as the government schemes supporting aviation sector, it is important for us to now look at the challenges, and these are perpetual challenges always plaguing aviation sector as far as India is concerned. Now another factor has been added this particular year, which is COVID, but that is not a problem which has always been there. What has always been there is the government intervention, high fuel prices or aviation turbine fuel, congestion and high airport charges. So if you compare aviation sector with those of other similar transports, the government intervention in this particular sector is much higher. And you know that how competitive Indian aviation industry is. Except for 1 or 2 carriers, almost all of them are loss making. Burden of regulation on these operators is very high. And that regulation mainly deals with the routes which are very profitable. For example, international routes. And the simple example of this is that the flying rights over another country's territory do not lie in the hands of an airline company. Rather, it depends on the political relation and bilateral treaty between 2 or more countries. And hence, a private operator's fly over a country and reaches another country is not a matter of private agreement, but is rather a matter to be discussed among national governments. And hence, the intervention of the government comes into play. Then we know that the fuel used in the aviation sector is different from petrol and diesel, and it is known as aviation turbine fuel. Now, the problem is that the prices of ATF in India are higher than the global market. And mainly the reason behind that is higher domestic taxes. For example, center charges 14% excise duty on ATF, and at the same time states levy their own sales tax that can go as high as 29%, leading to very expensive ATFs. And hence, unlike the global scenario, the Indian aviation sector's operational cost component is dominated by ATF cost, which can reach up to 45% of the total expenses. Then comes the issue of congestion. And this, if you remember, deals with the supply side of the issue. So if you have traveled through Delhi and Mumbai, you must have noted the long queues. And hence, these two major airports in our country are currently saturated. And this overcrowding is leading to a huge wastage of fuel. Apart from that, the runways are saturated too. And because of that, the incoming aircrafts have to hover in the sky for a very long period of time, leading to a wastage of fuel, making the flights very expensive. And hence there is a need for additional airports, especially in the major cities. And finally, the issue of high airport charges. So you know that there are charges at the airports while landing and taking off. But they are different for domestic and international airports. But in India, these charges are very high. And these charges also vary depending upon the categorization of the airport. The same runway can be categorized as domestic and the charges would be lower. And if the categorization is of international, then the charges will be higher, which leads to higher operational costs of aviation companies. So these are the major challenges before the aviation industry. Keep all the perspectives which we have discussed in your mind. This shall cover your demand for GS3 aviation sector requirements. So this particular article, India is moving towards a form of elected autocracy, appears on page number 10. Now this statement has been given by Justice A.P. Shah. He was speaking at the inaugural session of the Janata Parliament webinar being organized jointly by hundreds of civil society groups this week. According to him, slowly and steadily the institutions of Indian democracy are being curtailed. For example, the budget session had been adjourned sine die on March 23rd, despite the fact that Parliament had previously continued to function through other times of crisis. For example, during the wars of 1962 as well as 71, and met the very next day after its own building faced a terror attack in 2001. So if those kinds of adversities were faced in such a brave way, what is stopping the Parliament right now to start its session? Especially given the fact that when we have access to such advanced information and communication technology tools. Also, Justice A.P. Shah has said that parliaments of other countries had also continued to function through hybrid or completely virtual sessions. And hence, in this regard, he has commented that India is slowly moving towards a form of elected autocracy. Now, to start with, the term itself appears like an oxymoron, because elected and autocracy are quite contradictory to each other. So what we shall do is that we shall understand this term elected autocracy. We will understand how it is achieved without laying importance to what Justice Shah has to say about India. This discussion mainly concentrates on the meaning of the term elected autocracy. Now, at the outset, it is important to mention here that these views have been expressed by political scientists Levitsky and Ziblatt, which was ultimately used by our Justice A.P. Shah. This discussion is in no way to suggest that India is either approaching or has already become elected autocracy. It's just the fact that since it has appeared in the newspaper, you should be aware of the meaning and the consequences of the term elected autocracy. To start with, autocracy means a system of government by one person who rules with absolute power. A state or society governed by one person with absolutely no one to challenge him or her. And in this regard, it becomes important for us to understand what changes does this addition of elected terms before autocracy means. So first, let us understand what elected autocracy is not. So unlike typical fascist and authoritarian regimes like communism or military dictators, elected autocrats do not subvert democracy immediately. There is no formal declaration of emergency or violent capture of power. Free and fair elections are held regularly, giving the semblance or resemblance of a vibrant democracy. Then the question arises that if these things do not happen in an elected autocracy, why do we call it an autocracy? And because democracy is subverted through small incremental steps. which in isolation do not seem to be problematic, because each year a law will come, an amendment of the constitution will come, an executive order will come. So each and every step, when looked at in isolation, does not appear to be problematic, and in fact are quite legal. But when viewed cumulatively over a period of time, these moves reveal a pattern indicating the capture of power, an absolute capture of power, just like autocracy, but achieved through elected means or democratic means. So, in a democratic setup, when so many checks and balances have been made just to ensure this fact, how do elected governments try to achieve autocracy? And that is achieved in few stages. Let us understand them. So they start by the capturing of referees, or you can also call them capture of the independent autonomous institutions such as judiciary, election commission, law enforcement agencies, or auditor generals, as well as the media. Now we know that these institutions act as a check on the political executive, so that democracy can be played in a free and fair manner, and the competition is still on. So the elected autocrats start by filling these institutions with their loyalists. Packing these institutions with the government loyalists helps shield the political executive from being held accountable and adds to the firepower of the executive, especially when the executive wants to take on to the dissenter or the opponents of the government. This capture or power comes very, very handy there. So once the organization which act as a check on political executive have been taken over, then comes the issue of appropriation of important figures, especially the historical figures of the country. So these individuals can be intellectuals, cultural icons, cinematic stars, business leaders, and this appropriation is done in order to propagate the government narrative. Then once the appropriation of the icons of the society and the nation is done, then comes the stage where elected autocrats disregard the mutual tolerance. Now we all know that for a liberal democracy to thrive, political parties need to accept each other as patriots and as legitimate rivals and adversaries. One political party may or may not agree with the agenda of the other party. But if other parties are as abiding of the constitution as the ruling party is, one cannot deny the fact that the other parties are also patriot and want the benefit of the nation as a whole. Their approach and the way they want to do it may be different. Ultimately, in autocracy, all the parties who do not agree with the views of the ruling party are branded as the enemy of the nation, and hence hounding them becomes totally legal. As people become less and less critical of the government failures and are willing to accept authoritarianism, because the overall belief of the society boils down to the single fact that the party which has controlled these institutions and has appropriated all the important figures is the only viable and legitimate option to rule. And hence ultimately all the tools provided in the democracy are used to undermine the roots of the democracy itself. This news appears on page number 1. US FDA nod for rapid inexpensive saliva test. Now recently, United States Food and Drugs Administration has authorized the emergency use of saliva-based diagnostic test for COVID-19. Now many have hailed this as a game changer as it provides results very, very rapidly. The testing method has been named as Saliva Direct. So of course, as the name suggests, this is based on saliva. Now so far all the techniques of testing of COVID-19 which we have seen and discussed are either blood-based like antibody tests and swab-based like RT-PCR tests. But this particular test has come as a surprise because it detects the presence or absence of virus up to a great level of accuracy in saliva itself. So the testing is performed from a spit sample of individuals. Now the question arises that when we already have blood as well as swab testing methods, why do we need spit samples? Now that is because of various factors. Now it is very obvious that in case of Saliva Direct, the sample collection is very, very easy. It does not require any kind of technical knowledge, and the patient himself or herself can collect the sample by simply spitting in a vial. So in the places where the technically trained staff is very, very limited, this technique will be very, very helpful. And also if the high number of tests are required, especially for example in larger cities of our country, The Saliva Direct will make it very easy for the health officials to collect the samples. Also, utmost attention and care is required while the sample is being collected in case of swab testing and blood testing. But if the patient himself spits in a vial and packs the vial in an airtight container and send it to the lab, then the demand for PPP as well as other kinds of protective instruments will decrease very rapidly. And also, sometimes taking samples from elderly and children becomes very difficult, especially if it is a swab and blood sample. And in those cases, these Saliva Direct technology will come very handy. Of course, only the sample collection technique is different. After that, it still follows the RT-PCR method for the identification of the virus itself. So as we had said in the first discussion, we will look at some of the static and prelims related information dealing with RTI at the end of the discussion. So what is information according to RTI? So according to RTI, information means any kind of material in any form, including records, documents, memos, emails, opinions, advices, press releases, circulars, orders, logbooks, contracts, reports, papers, samples, models, data material held in any electronic form, and information related to any private body which can be accessed by a public authority under any other law for the time being in force. This definition is being given in section 2F of RTI Act. Then what does right to information means? Right to information means right to inspect work, document as well as records, take notes of those records, extracts, certified copies of documents or records, take certified samples of materials, obtain information in forms of printouts, floppies, tapes, video cassettes or any other electronic mode or through printouts. So the definition of right to information is very wide and it's given in section 2J. Similarly, the question is, what does public authority mean? We have discussed public authority many times. What does it mean? It means any authority or body or institution of self-government established or constituted A. by or under the Constitution, B. by any other law made by Parliament, C. by any other law made by state legislature, and D. by notification issued or order made by appropriate government. And it also includes any body owned, controlled or substantially financed by the government and non-governmental organizations like NGOs which are substantially financed directly or indirectly by any government. So what are the obligations of these public authorities under the RTI Act? Now, public authorities are to maintain and catalog records in accordance to the Act and ensure that records that are appropriate are computerized within reasonable time and subject to availability of resources. Now, who are these PIOs often talked about? PIOs or Public Information Officers, according to this Act, are officers in charge to provide information to persons requesting information under this Act. So whenever you seek information from any public authority, it is the responsibility of the PIO within that public authority to give you such information. Now, who are the appellate authorities? Appellate authorities, of course, come into play when there are some issues in the information which has been sought. Either the information has been denied or the correct information has not been provided. So you can challenge those decisions of the public authority in appellate authorities. So an appellate authority is required to look into complaints made by people regarding A. inability to submit requests to central or public information officer, denial of access to information, where no response to information within the specified time limit has been given, or unreasonable fee has been charged, or any other matter relating to requesting or obtaining access to information. So a first appeal can be made to a senior ranked central public information officer or a state public information officer within 30 days from the date of expiry or from receipt of decision. So for example, if today is the day when the information has been denied to you and you know that today is 17th of August. So you have time till 17th of September to make an appeal in Central Public Information Office. Now the question arises, can any information be denied or rejected? And the answer is of course yes. There are clauses under which information can be denied, and those conditions are: if such an information affects the sovereignty and integrity of our country, the security, strategic, scientific or economic interests of our country, or could lead to incitement of an offense. Disclosure of information is also forbidden in those cases where such information is to be published by any court, tribunal, or if the disclosure may constitute contempt of court. And finally, all trade secrets, matters of commercial confidence, and matters dealing with intellectual property right are beyond the purview of RTI Act. And finally, what is the importance of Right to Information Act? So obviously it empowers people to ask for information about central, state government and also NGOs which are substantially funded by the government. Then the law gives citizens of India the tools to fight against corruption. RTI gives people the right to hold the government and organizations substantially funded by the government accountable. And RTI gives citizens the right to ask for information and decide, based on the information received, whether their constitutional rights have been met or not. And finally, this law arms individuals with information so that they can advocate for themselves. Let us now move on to the question of the day. So question of the day for 16th of August 2020 was, consider the following statements. Statement 1, UAE share land border with 2 countries only. Now this is correct of course because UAE shares land borders only with Oman and Saudi Arabia. Statement 2 is of course correct and there is no need for justification, leading us to the right answer. See both 1 and 2. Now there is a news article which appears again on page number 1. Zoos of 2 particular cities go online, and hence in this regard we have formulated question of the day. Consider the following zoos: Kolkata Zoo, Delhi Zoo and Jaipur Zoo. Which of the above have recently gone online? A, 1 only, B, 2 only, C, 3 only and D, 1 and 2 only.